and barriers. One of the challenges that we face is the misuse of the language of adaptive management. And we looked at the example of marine parks, where adaptive management is is used by some, particularly in the fisheries sector, to argue in favour of temporary or movable feasts in the marine conservation space that ultimately undermine not only our conservation goals but the resilience of those ecosystems and their capacity to adapt to climate change. So we need to be cautious around terminology. A related area is that tension between flexibility and adaptive management on the one hand and emerging narrative around non-regression in environmental law and environmental protections. How do we ensure that we have the necessary flexibility to deal with predictable or unpredictable change, but also maintain or enhance environmental protection over time? We know that those protections are necessary to maintain the resilience of ecosystems and our own communities in the face of climate change. So we must not allow the narrative of flexibility and adaptive management to in fact undermine or weaken environmental protections over time. In that context, existing use rights present a particular challenge in the area of planning and development control in particular. How do we deal with existing use rights in a context where changing flood regimes or coastal erosion may change the basis on which we've ordered our communities and our urban settlements in particular? And this is in a broader context of sustained and unprecedented economic expansion, which diminishes our opportunities for adaptation. We went on a range of other tangents, which I won't cover completely, but a couple of the additional issues or opportunities that we touched on were the need to ensure that any adaptive framework is transparent and accountable, that it has strong public participation, but also that it integrates the best available information. Now, that information should include not only formal scientific information, but also local and traditional knowledge into those decision-making processes. And one of the key barriers that we see to conservation outcomes generally, but effective adaptation more specifically, is a mismatch between formal legal frameworks and institutions and the institutions and communities that may actually be effectively making decisions about natural resource management. So that's a topic that I think we'll come back to this afternoon, but we identified that as one of the key barriers. So that's my best attempt at synthesising a fairly roaming conversation. Have I missed anything important? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now turn to this group over here.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, you should not feel sorry that you were indisciplined. I think it was across the board. As you have realized that we have 3 groups now, we have only 2. One just disappeared like that. So it's part of the indiscipline problem that we have faced in this meeting. We had to adapt because this is we're talking about adaptation. So two of us, me and so young, we had to go to join that new group. And this group actually, when they were answering this particular question, the opportunities they saw was in terms of ecosystem. They looked at ecosystems, and one was that the forests, coastal zones, and urban areas as ecosystems. And could you go back to the second question?
The population, we also talked about both the urban and also local communities outside of the city.
Yeah, and there was is it a concept, urbanization?
Urbanization.
Yeah, it's not a legal concept. As I said, one of our very main Greek architects.
I think this is going to be a group thing.
Free flow of ideas. Now we're talking about urbanization and the IG targets. And the question was posed since 2050, about 70% of the population will live in cities. I think it's very important that cities start thinking about this whole concept. And I mentioned that in Singapore, there's a very maverick architect who conceived of this idea of urbanization, which is rural and urban. So you don't need to really come to the city, but you find an urban area and you combine, you merge the ideas of rural, keeping the rural as it is with all the biodiversity, plus some aspects of urbanization. Now, in one of his lectures, he said that his idea has been bought by some investors in India and in Indonesia. And if you Google, you will find a variation of urbanization. I think it's catching on in the United States. So this is an idea that you can also merge with the concept, it's not legal concept, of eco-cities. And now you find all over the world, and I give examples of Holborn, and in England, where in Manchester, they consider this as a living laboratory, so you can do things with it. You can share your ideas, and in Singapore, we together, Singapore and China, together we are building a Tianjin city. Whether this can be replicated, of course, depends. Some eco-cities have failed, but I think if you think in terms of organizing a small area like 20-30 kilometers, and you get a number of eco-cities, you then can connect and you can learn from the experience of one another. So this is a very innovative concept which we can develop further. So this was on the aspect of urbanization and the REG.
So that's one example of one way of implementing adaptive management, making the rural urban to reduce the immigration, but maintaining the rural atmosphere within these urban areas and the eco-city concept. And another thing was that from urban area perspective is the question of consumption of energy. And the group thought maybe one way is to try and start engaging in smaller energy projects. For instance, we know today that the solar energy can be seriously harnessed to produce a massive amount of electricity in cities. So another way to adapt is to have smaller scale projects rather than continuing to go like large scale dam building and produce a lot of electricity, transferring it 2,000 kilometers away. So with this group thought maybe having small scale electricity projects, and specifically trying to invest more in solar concepts or solar energy production principles or systems. Also, the other question was other ways in terms, this is very much legal in terms of adaptive management, is that the government, improving the governance systems and disciplining the governance of not natural systems only, but also how the investments are done in these ecological areas. Also, the question, another way was the question of knowledge transfer or knowledge transmission for adaptation to the people, and making people understand more the adaptation and the adaptive capacity they possess in their areas to use them, and to learn more from either outside or from within. Is there any point for expansion?
Just the community focus.
I guess just our community focus on community management. There was a good amount of discussion on it.
It's the question of barriers. Again, the knowledge in terms of one other thing was, as part of that, was strengthening community property rights, and the barrier was one of them is the conflict between should I say state versus customary law, especially on property rights and control, for instance, on land. And so that's one of the barriers. It's always been Chinese. I think it's across the board, because the other group mentioned that too. Another barrier has been the indiscipline in terms of collusion between government and private investment. So when you give an example that, for instance, for energy supply, adapting the approach of you having small-scale projects, maybe with solar energy and generator and electricity for small towns or small communities. So the collusion between government and private sector may lead to government to still prefer large-scale projects, because they involve a lot of cash, a lot of money, and as an aspect on weaknesses in the governance, this may mean people engaged, they have personal interests and this kind of thing. And this may be a barrier to adapting the small-scale kind of investments. Another challenge or another barrier was that the state may not want to give away the power to control the rights on ownership of the natural resources. There was a discussion on what was it called? Marble case?
The marble case in Australia.
Marble case in Australia. Maybe some expansion on that? Marble case? Maybe. Not everybody knows the marbles, or have the marbles to know the marbles.
I think the question or the issue of the barrier we're discussing was, these competing understanding of land ownership, and that a lot of communities have generally been dispossessed. And going back to the state and saying, the state is perhaps not entirely interested in giving back rights to communities. And in Australia, the land essentially proving Aboriginal rights to land, the case essentially says you need to prove to us that you had European-style property rights before we arrived here. And that's completely impossible, and it's a completely ridiculous legal test, and I don't understand how anyone could have ever come up with that test. But that's an extreme barrier, is when, the state, which is run by the colonizer, has then, through its judicial system, created legal hurdles that are completely insurmountable for communities. And it's like, in no reasonable way could you ever prove that to be true. So it's really making sure that we don't have these types of barriers that are insurmountable, so that communities can be engaged in resource management. Going back to kind of colonial states, saying a lot of the local rights have already been sucked up to the national level. Now, how do we get them to give the rights back? And most states have questions on whether they want to use it.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Any questions?
So if you actually look in the CBD website, you will actually see the Singapore Index on Biodiversity. And basically, we are encouraging cities to enrich their biodiversity. Right? So we have a number of cities have partnered with us and they are testing this. And it's actually an initiative from the government. The National Parks Board came out with this, and there are guidelines as to how you need to go about, detailing your index. Okay, so just a quick point on to it.
Thank you. Any more comments?
Yes.
Please.
What was just mentioned, I think, is Decision 22 of COP10, which is a plan of action on subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities for biodiversity, which does mention Singapore. And so if you want to go back to the actual decision, it's Decision X22 of CBD, COP10.
Expert referencing there. We're going to break for lunch now. As mentioned, lunch is provided here. Would ask you to eat in the room, but we're starting back at 2, so if you go away, go for a walk, be back at 2, and please do come back. We've got in the afternoon, what we're doing. This morning's session was really about laying the legal questions related to climate change, adaptation. And the afternoon, we're looking at some interesting segments dealing with connectivity in protected areas, and another one on water. So it's really illustrating the sorts of things that we've discussed this morning. So we'll see you all back here at 2.
And help yourself to lunch.
Yes.